much for this invitation to speak with the Anscombe Bioethics Center on the question related to the ethics and efficacy of track and trace. My remarks are going to be organized around 3 points. One is what some other individuals that have been invited to speak have also talked about is, can it work? And if it can work or can't work, should it be done? Because certainly just because something can work doesn't mean that we should do it. The second point that I want to make is a question about whether there is some benefit as a type of placebo effect. So what you might already guess is I'm not sure that track and trace is going to quote unquote control the virus as many public officials hope, or at least to the extent that they hope. But is it possible that the track and trace methods, which we'll talk about a few different ones, is it possible that the track and trace methods are good for a society on a short-term basis as a placebo effect to give us, it might not work, but perhaps it gives us some calm as we go about trying to live through this time that is unique, not unique for the world, but very unique for everyone alive in the world today. My third point will be what I would propose as interim measures for track and trace that protect privacy of data and the confidentiality of data that would be collected during track and trace, as well as a what's sometimes called a circuit breaker of how to try and make this not permanent. And I'll pick up right there at the end and go back to the beginning. It strikes me that in the context of whether this will work, the underlying ethical question among many is, should it be done? Because there is this considerable amount of danger with track and trace measures, particularly with them becoming permanent or with them being able to be revived or triggered to come back in ways that could be abused. So what is track and trace? Well, as I'm using the term track and trace, I'm using it very broadly. There are certainly many mechanisms, and in the UK, there have been attempts and reboots to try and revive different aspects of track and trace. But I'll think of it generally as, is it track and trace with an app on a smartphone that's able to push out messages, collect data, and get the word out to people that they've either been exposed to the virus or that they have in some degree, or they've been exposed to someone who tests positive or is simply symptomatic. And there's been, over the course of the track and trace program, there have been proposals and efforts to be made along those continuums, everything from notifying individuals via their smartphone and their apps to as to whether they have been around someone long enough, they've had a contact with someone who exhibits symptoms, but they don't quite know yet whether they're positive for the novel coronavirus, to they've been in contact with someone who is tested positive for the novel coronavirus. So this creates an interesting spectrum of how the apps have been proposed to be used. And there is, I think, a fairly weighty point about over-notification, where even if a person accepts that this could help manage the virus or manage the pandemic in some way, if you over tell people about their risks and their exposures, does that mitigate the efficacy of telling them about the exposures? So in that spectrum of being notified by your smartphone that you have been in contact with someone who exhibits symptoms, and that's what was proposed in the early programming for the track and trace apps, that there was concern that this would be going off and you'd be getting notifications too frequently. Not only would you be getting notifications so frequently that it would make any semblance of normalcy that the app would and track and trace would try to bring to society impossible, because if you got a notification, you would need to leave a meeting or leave a conference or leave the gathering that you're in. And if you didn't, what would be your potential liability to that group? What would be your moral liability, moral exposure for not leaving? And then there's the question of receiving so many of those notifications that they go into the background, and you don't abide by the warnings. So this was I think early on, and I think the warnings about being around someone who is symptomatic is a good framing for the rest of the discussion, because that seemed as though there was some real thought put into that with respect to the public, with respect to the government, and that just seemed too much, and perhaps not only too much, too burdensome for the society to hear as individuals frequently. I could only imagine my phone being ding, 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 ding with the alerts that I may have been near someone in a store or in a queue where there would be that person is now symptomatic. So that the disruption, it could have caused more disruption than it's worth. And it seemed as though that there became a consensus that was not efficacious, would not be efficacious, because it would be over notifying, over tracking, so to speak. The tracking would occur, but the notifications would nullify the benefits of trying to track the contacts related to simply symptomatic patients. And then the movement over to contact with individuals who are positive for the novel coronavirus. So that's a bit where I think we have gotten to with respect to traditional contact tracing, where there is some sickness, there is some, whether it's symptoms or it's diagnosis, the history of contact tracing does not involve tracking movements of people. The history of contact tracing, where it has succeeded is where there is a diagnosis and then tracing back where the transmission may have come from. This is it raises another question of how has it been successful in the past? Can it be successful on a large scale? Because if it can't be successful on a large scale, and it's going to be incredibly intrusive to life and disruptive potentially to society, perhaps even making people more burdened with anxiety and worry in the notifications. Well, if it's not going to work, then that needs to be part of the calculus. And what we see, without going too much into detail in the history of contact tracing with communicable diseases, it's been most successful when you can be very precise about the transmission, and that the transmissions have been, for lack of a better way to put it, small. And a comparison to the transmissions of the novel coronavirus as has occurred in 2020, which has been widespread among millions of people. So there are certainly certain types of communicable diseases where it has been in the history of contact tracing, it's been easier than others to figure out how that path is and then to either warn those who may have been exposed or to try to get them help or to quarantine them to make sure that the transmission isn't further spread. What we have with the 2020 pandemic is we have millions of people inside of the UK who have been exposed and are continuing to be exposed. That it doesn't quite comport, the volume and the size doesn't quite comport with other contact tracing programs that have been successful in the past. So it's not to say that we can't be successful, but it raises a very big question and in my mind, doubt whether this can be successful. And so that comes back to, should it be done? So if we think about some of the classic frameworks for thinking about ethics, just because it would work, and if we stipulate that contact tracing would work, it doesn't mean that it should be done. We need to look at the specific actions that are occurring as part of the contact tracing and also the future of what contact tracing is setting up to decide whether it should be done, even if it could, quote unquote, work. But if it can't work, that also needs to be put into the calculus. And how much can't it work? Is it an all or nothing that it can't work? Or could it alleviate some of the burdens on society and and managing the disease transmission? Because working, quote unquote, does not necessarily mean 100% efficacy. We certainly see this with medicines as they are analyzed for whether they're safe and effective, and focusing on the efficacy we can never guarantee 100% efficacy with medicines. Currently, as the world is hoping for a vaccine, many of the regulatory authorities looking at the clinical trials that are going on are looking for 50% efficacy of a vaccine in order for it to have an authorization to be utilized by the public. And so I think that's also a calculus of how much what's the percentage, if we can even quantify it, that contact tracing will work. What are we as a society willing to accept? If it won't work 100%, which it won't, because nothing really works 100% in these measures. There's always a certain level of risk we have to accept. What's that level of risk we're willing to accept for a trade-off of what could be the dangers of contact tracing? So some of the dangers of contact tracing, others have described, I think, very well and eloquently. The ones which come to mind to me and that concern me the most is the storage of data about individuals and the security of data. Second is the shift from tracking of information about an individual's diagnosis to tracking their movements and how that information, it's one thing to track my diagnosis that I tested positive for the novel coronavirus. It's another thing, I think, to track and record the data of where I move and where do I go. What stores do I go to? When do I go to stores? When do I go to meet a friend at the friend's flat? All of that. This is another level of tracking that raises some considerable concerns. We've seen, and it sounds a little bit like a science fiction or potential dystopian situation where these movements are so detailed in being tracked, but this is how some countries have done their contact tracing. certainly in China, the use of the QR codes has been considerably controversial because in China, the QR codes have colors, and depending upon the colors of the QR codes as you swipe to enter doors or to get on public transport, doors may or may not open depending upon the color that you have. So there are some countries that publicly are using the technology and something like track and trace in ways that would, I think, likely, I don't think I'm going out on a limb here to say horrify individuals in the UK. But that is a danger. So the use of QR codes, which is on the potential and to what extent that the QR codes, perhaps not using the color system that China uses with its QR code app, but even simply swiping your own personal QR code to know that you've gone into a pub or restaurant or go into a store. And long before anything is known about whether you have symptoms of the virus or you are positive for the novel coronavirus, that type of tracking movements of people that we've seen, moving from tracking for diagnoses to tracking movements, is something which we have to think long and hard about. Is that something that we want for society? So in that calculus of stipulating that contact tracing won't manage the virus completely, how much do we think it could help society? If it's 50%, and it has some efficacious marker of 50%, such as what the regulating authorities are looking for in the vaccines, is that enough to trade off tracking of movements? I don't think society has grappled with this very much yet, but we need to. And even once we get past the novel coronavirus as a pandemic, these questions are going to stay because technology has a way of sticking around. So let's say there is a consensus that we are willing to give up some of a certain percentage of our liberties or certain types of liberties in exchange for how much efficacy in contact tracing and in tracing movements is that we wouldn't give up our liberties until it hits 90%, or confident that it hits 90%, confident that it hits 50%, or even if it's 15% effective and that saves a few thousand lives, is that something that as a society we're willing to give up some liberties? These are enormously complex ethical questions, and we are working in 2020 at warp speed through these questions. Or I should say, we're working through 2020 at warp speed, and policies are being floated, they're being batted down. Some of them are moving forward, some of them then get modified, but things are going so quickly that it seems as though there isn't time to pause on the ethics. But we must pause on the ethics, because if we're only looking at the consequences, and even if those consequences are good, then that's not, at least in my view, that's not a very healthy society, and that's not a very healthy ethical discussion if all we're basing our reasons on are the consequences. If the consequences are good, classic consequentialism. Well, if it's going to produce a good outcome, if it works, then whatever it takes to get to that good outcome is ethical. There's certainly many thinkers who subscribe to that, but to me, that's not a very good way to think about what's right and our actions. And it's also a temptation of short-term looking at a situation. So in here, we certainly have an emergency. We've had this emergency that's gone on throughout the year, and it's an emergency which will likely go on into 2021. Everyone wants it to stop. And everyone wants to get through this in some way. But how do we get through it? Again, I'm not convinced that track and trace, I don't think anyone is really convinced track and trace in its manifestations would be 100% effective. But even if it had a high effectiveness, are we tempted to think about the short-term goal, the short-term need, and it's a real short-term need to get past this pandemic and ignore the actions that are taken in order to get to that place? That sets us up in the future for in very large scale public policy concerns to replicate that type of thinking, where we are adapting to or promoting or simply accepting public policies that try to achieve a good, legitimate outcome and may even work on a short-term basis, but ignoring how we get there and ignoring the activities that need to occur in order to get there. That's certainly something that I'm concerned about, that is we're not thinking deeply enough on the various methods of contact tracing and track and trace that could set us up in the future for some problems. But it also has problems and dangers on an individual level. If the state will be making decisions on a short-term basis, focusing solely on the consequences and what is hoped for as a good outcome, is that teaching a lesson to individuals? What are individuals picking up on that from that in our personal lives and in our personal choices? Do we all become consequentialists because we have dealt with this very large public policy question and focused solely on how do we get to the end of it without the means and the specific steps to get to the end of it? Well, these parts of my remarks are sort of the longest parts of my remarks. I said the second piece, which I'll move to, is a question about the placebo effect. Although I think it's unknown as to how effective the various mechanisms of track and trace would be, and again, I don't think anyone could hazard to guess on this because it's never been done before. It's as if the entire world is in its own clinical trial right now, and each country and certainly in the UK and the multiple countries within the United Kingdom are doing things a little bit differently. Those are it's bit we're in our own type of clinical trial with respect to this. So we don't know the outcomes. There's an hypothesis, but we don't know the outcome. We don't know the outcomes. But let's assume for the moment that even though we don't know the outcomes, that there is a good chance that this will save some people, but not a lot. And perhaps in other circumstances, it would be something that is a small level of effectiveness where we wouldn't normally give up certain liberties at that level. I'll simply say perhaps it's 15%. It's a 15% effectiveness. We wouldn't normally give up our liberties for that. That's But even though track and trace may have a low effectiveness rate, if that's what turns out, there is so much anxiety in society related to the coronavirus and the transmission of it, as well as the idiopathic way that it affects individuals. There are some, there certainly are some templates for how it affects individuals. It has a significant variable of being idiosyncratic in way it affects it. So it's quite anxiety producing, and that if that anxiety is so challenging that society is paralyzed, that we as social beings cannot do what we do as humans in order to function well, which is to interact with people and to be in society, even if it's a smaller form of society and smaller interaction. How damaging is that to us as individuals? How damaging is that to society? So is it possible that track and trace, even if it has a low effectiveness level, even if it has these risks in the future of sticking and coming back in other emergencies that are declared, could it be useful for society as a placebo effect to give us some comfort that there are mechanisms that to let us know if we may have been exposed to someone who has tested positive for the novel coronavirus? And does that get us over the paralysis so that we move out into society a little bit more? And which is not to say, this is sort of placebo effect question that I raise about track and trace is not to suggest that it should be done because of the placebo effect, but I do think that there is a level of anxiety that we're all participating in that is affecting individuals in ways that we aren't quite aware yet how it's affecting us, and what are the long-term effects of us not socializing as much as we have been, not interacting with society. So if this gives us a little, even if it doesn't work, and even if it doesn't work to a level where we would give up our liberties, is there an argument that it could help us enough to move past that fear and that anxiety to interact with individuals and to preserve something that has a more long-term issue, remember, something that's much more long-term that we have to be concerned about is the mental well-being of individuals, and collectively how all individuals manage their mental health through this, how we have children develop in society and in interaction with individuals, and how simply we as individuals can manage some goals that help us with satisfaction and lead us ultimately towards some happy fulfillment as humans, which is it's necessary to be in society. It's the very rare individual, and perhaps it's even a supernatural specialty that a person has to not be in society and to not interact with human beings, but find fulfillment. So this is just simply natural that we need to be in society, and we have to get over this in some way, even though there's this great danger out there to us, or we could be seeing effects on society and individuals for I think quite literally decades to come if we if depending upon how this might be affecting us. So I am unlike I perhaps am the unicorn, and in the individuals who are responding to the question of ethics and efficacy, because I think it's dubious whether track and trace can achieve the level of management of the virus that is hoped for. I'm concerned about sticking around of technology with track and trace, and the movement from tracking individuals and knowing who has a certain diagnosis to the tracking of movements of people's. But I am sympathetic to the idea that there might be some need for this as a placebo effect to help us get out of the house and to get out of our flats a bit and move around. But that leads me to my last point in my remarks, and that is that how to manage the risks. There's no way to completely manage the risks of any track and trace any track and trace program or track and trace method. There's always the potential that there could be slippage of information, private and confidential information that's inappropriately disclosed, or the information on the movements of people that would be used in inappropriate ways. But I think that there are some potential things that can be put into the law and into the rules and the regulations in the rollout of track and trace programs that help to mitigate those risks. As I say, I don't think they'll completely mitigate, but the two things that I think are central is data that is collected in track and trace, I believe needs to be destroyed at a certain point, and there needs to be assurances that the data is destroyed. This is, I think this is a spectrum, depending upon what track and trace does and how contact tracing is rolling out, will depend on what data needs to be destroyed and how quickly it needs to be destroyed. So a diagnosis of the novel coronavirus in the early stages of the pandemic was a very, very sensitive piece of information. Now, any health information about an individual is sensitive, but it was quite sensitive because there were so few people in the very beginning, in late February, very, very early March, who were diagnosed. Now there's many there's millions who have been exposed, and the volume is so pronounced that the shame that perhaps was there originally, or the concern about reputation, or the danger that you presented in society, and the potential isolation that you would suffer long after you had overcome the virus, if you hopefully overcame it. Some of that is gone. So having had a diagnosis of the novel coronavirus is not as sensitive as I think as it was in early. But other data that's associated with track and trace and the various methods is very sensitive. The movement of a person, where they are going, where they have been, what time they have been there, these types of things, that type of data, I believe, to the extent that it is being recorded, should have a hard destruction date. That could be, ideally, I would suggest a rolling destruction date. Although I am sure that many epidemiologists would disagree with me on that, as that data would want to be mined for research for other public health purposes while we're in the pandemic. But But I think if it's not destroyed on a rolling basis, such as every 6 weeks or every 8 weeks, where you're past the point of the danger of the transmission, interacting with individuals, and the data would be it wouldn't have any practical use. It might have some research use, but not any practical real-time use. That would be ideal. But I also think a calendar date may be good, and the calendar date would also be a sunset date for the track and trace. And I would suggest that the track and trace method have a hard calendar date for its sunset, for its ending, disconnected to the pandemic's state. So let's, for example, use December 31. So on the 31st of December, if track and trace ended, then what would, the pandemic isn't going to end on 31 December, but if the program ended on that date, then a couple of things could occur. One, there would be some confidence that it will end at some point. So this trade-off of liberty and the information about us will be destroyed, and the tracking of our movements in such incredible detail will end. But also it would engender a public debate, because if the sunset date in the law is disconnected from the state of the pandemic, then there would need to be a debate about whether to continue the track and trace methods. Then there could be a serious discussion about, has it worked? Has it reduced the rate of transmission? This trade-off of liberty, are we comfortable with it in light of how much it may have helped or may have not helped? Maybe we won't be comfortable with it anymore. And so that allows for the debates to, for the program to end. And some of us might be more comfortable with that trade-off of liberty if we know that it will end at a certain date. Now, it might be that there develops a consensus that it has enormously helped manage the transmission, and perhaps it could be demonstrated that the data is being securely maintained, and so it could be renewed. Again, not renewed for forever or until the whim of an expert, but renewed to another calendar date. So from 31 December to perhaps 31 March. And the 31st of March, it would sunset, and another debate could occur. So those are that is something which I offer in remarks as perhaps a practical middle course as we work through the very challenging question of the ethics and efficacy of track and trace. Thank you.